Thank you all so much for joining. My name is Sarah Pierce, and I am the EveryHome program coordinator. I oversee our EveryHome program that seeks to include affordable housing and affordable utilities in the same conversation. So on the fourth Tuesday of every month, we do a webinar related to housing and affordable utilities and how that can affect our low-income populations. Today we have Kara Goldenberg, Xavier Zing, and Charles Cannon with us from the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, on the call to discuss their findings from their report they just came out with on utility cost control, which we know is very much needed here in Kentucky. Just a bit about our speakers. Kara Goldenberg is a principal on RMI's carbon-free electricity program, where she leads RMI's work with utilities, regulators, and advocates to evolve utility business models and regulation to support an affordable and equitable transition to clean energy resources. In this role, Kara has engagements with the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, Connecticut Office of Consumer Counsel, Illinois Commerce Commission, and North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, NARUC, and other stakeholders. She is also the co-author of various RMI reports focused on cost control, performance-based regulation, and regulatory process design and DER utilization. Xavier Zing is an associate at RMI's carbon-free electricity team, where he focuses on utility regulation and rate design. His work supports efforts to modernize utility business models and align regulatory structures with affordability and accountability goals, with a particular focus on multi-year rate plans, fuel cost sharing, and performance-based mechanisms. He has co-authored several RMI reports on cost control and performance-based regulation, and he conducts regulatory research on quantitative analyses to help partners assess how specific policy and financial choices affect customer outcomes and utility incentives. And we also have Charles Cannon on the call. He is a manager with RMI's carbon-free electricity team, working on load growth and emissions reporting in the electricity sector. Charles oversees a team working on large load tariffs and regulatory interventions that drive new clean energy development. Prior to RMI, Charles worked on electrical engineering, designing commercial and utility solar installations. So thank you all so much for being on the call. We're very happy to have RMI. We will have a Q&A at the end of the call, so be sure to put your questions in the chat, and I will go ahead and pass it over to RMI.
Hi there. Good to be with you all today. Yeah, we have quite the presentation prepared for you, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Xavier, will you be able to share your screen? Great. Excellent. So what we're hoping to cover with you all today, we plan to give you guys an overview of some of the major cost drivers that we're seeing across the US. And we specifically also have looked into Kentucky. So we'll highlight some trends that we're seeing, as well as specific challenges to affordability. We'll then present a sort of overview of a framework that we published last year that provides different strategies to consider better containing utility costs and specific regulatory mechanisms that can support those strategies. We'll then have an opportunity to do a deep dive on 3 key strategies that we thought were most relevant potentially for Kentucky, given the load growth you all are estimated or that is expected in the state. And so those include anticipating future needs, how to leverage competition, and avoid inefficient system expansion. So we'll provide an opportunity to get more details in terms of what those strategies could look like given your context. And then, as Sarah said, we'll end our time with Q&A, but welcome questions in the chat as we continue. Next slide. I won't get into our intros, and Sarah just did a lovely job at that. But yeah, I'm joined by my colleagues, Charles and Xavier. We are part of the RMI's carbon-free electricity team and are excited to be with you all today. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Xavier to go through the cost drivers and challenges to affordability that we're seeing.
Great. Thank you, Kara, and thank you, Sarah. So before we step into specific strategies, I want to start with a little bit context about why we think the focus on cost control is very timely and important. So since in 2010, the average residential electricity rate have increased by nearly 40%. Also, at the same time, the right side map shows how this increase has translated into the average bill over the same period. We can see these increases has significantly impact customers' affordability. So now let's take a closer look at what's driving the rising electricity rate. The top chart on the slide shows that the change in the capital investment spending across distribution, transmission, generation, and others. So as you can see, distribution and transmission investment have grown dramatically. Transmission capital spending nearly doubled, while the distribution capex has increased by 160%. Well, there's still several valid reasons behind this rise, including system expansion and the replacements of aging infrastructure. And the bottom bar charts highlight that the utilities' expectation for future transmission and distribution investments. We can tell more than a third of distribution spending is projected to be focused on the adaptation, hardening, and resilience, while about 40% of transmission investments is allocated to expansion. So Kentucky follows a similar pattern. When we zoom in, both transmission and distribution capital investment have been trending up in recent years. This appears to be driven by the same reason as previously mentioned, and also the more frequent extreme weathers and wildfires in Kentucky State. Utilities, they're increasing transmission and distribution investment to strengthen their system resilience, like hardening wires and poles and expanding vegetation management. If we look specifically at capital investment over a longer horizon, we'll see few spikes on the generation side. Like, for example, in 2015, there was a clear increase when the Kane Round 7 generating station began operating. And we will see the similar spikes going forward, because Louisville Gas and Electric and Kentucky Utilities have been approved to spend $3 billion to build 2 new gas power stations to serve the future data center demand. This leads to questions why utilities are so in favor of capital investments, because under the traditional cost of service regulatory framework, capital expenditures will become the part of the utilities rate base, while the operating expenses just go directly into customers. This means that the capex presents an earning opportunity for shareholders, but OPEX is not, which lead into capex bias and gold plating issue. Capex bias refers to situation that a utility's preference for capital-intensive projects over other solutions like through OPEX, which may be less expensive. Gold plating refers to that the utility's incentive to over-invest in capital projects to earn a higher return. So moving forward, it will be pretty important to ensure that these capital investments, they are strategic and needed to better support cost control in the long term. Before we dive into the framework, we think it's important or helpful to contextualize cost control under the broader challenge of affordability area. We offer that there are 4 avenues to comprehensively address this challenge, of which, well, cost control is just one of them. The others contains cost responsibility, like how costs are apportioned predictability, whether customer can predict their bills, and agency of customers. Well, each of them are pretty important for a well-rounded regulatory strategy for address the affordability issue. But the strategic framework Kara will present later will primarily focus on the first, cost control. I'll hand over to Kara.
Yeah, thanks, Xavier. So as Xavier just said, this is RMI's strategic framework for cost control, which we created to support PUCs and other stakeholders as they tackle the challenge of containing utility costs in a time of increasing rates. The purpose of our framework is to sort of clarify the range of regulatory options available to strengthen utility cost containment across utility planning, across investment decisions, as well as how utilities operate the grid. And you can see here that the framework consists of 7 strategies, which are then operationalized by 16 levers. So those are sort of the specific regulatory mechanisms that could be considered in service of these strategies. So I'm going to quickly go through these, but we'll have an opportunity to do a deeper dive on 3 of them. So the first strategy is to anticipate future needs, and to do this by improving planning processes across generation, T&D, as well as by considering stranded risk. Something that I know is quite relevant today, especially with forecasted load growth and thinking about how states are going to meet that demand growth. The second strategy is focused on coordinating electric and gas regulations. And this could include thinking about how planning for the electric and gas systems can be better coordinated and share sort of inputs and assumptions, as well as ensuring that electrification of buildings, or sort of the evolution of gas utilities, is done in a way that is thoughtful and strategic and doesn't have unintended consequences for affordability. The third strategy here is squarely focused on lowering utility financing costs, so how they sort of raise money to make the investments necessary for the grid. And so this could include thinking about ways to reform how utilities authorized return on equity is set, their ROE, or using lower cost financing such as ratepayer bit-backed securitization for certain investments. This fourth strategy is focused on those perverse incentives that Xavier just went through, and is focused on really shifting utility financial incentives so that they are motivated or encouraged to actually reduce their spending versus the traditional model, which just rewards them for increasing their spending. This can be done with different types of regulatory mechanisms, such as multi-year rate plans, shared savings mechanisms, which are a type of performance incentive mechanism, but basically incentivize the utility to lower their spending or pursue a lower cost alternative solution. As well as mechanisms that are designed to level the playing field between capital solutions and those that are funded by operational expenditures. The fifth strategy of our framework is focused on leveraging competition in parts of the utility industry where third parties and customer-owned assets can help actually bring down resource and system costs. And so that can be through all source procurement, where you're looking at procuring different supply options and making sure that there's a process set up to allow different types of resources or resources owned by different entities to participate, as well as increasing the utilization of distributed energy resources or virtual power plants, which we'll be getting into in just a moment. The sixth strategy here is avoiding inefficient system expansion. And this is really a strategy focused on thinking about how to remove barriers to efficiently managing load, right? How can we ensure that utilities are pursuing energy efficiency or using different demand side management programs? Once again, increasingly important as we look at load forecasts and think about how we can be managing our load most efficiently instead of just adding to our peak. This strategies also includes thinking about capital cost trackers, which we know are abundant in Kentucky today. And so we will once again also return to that to provide a bit more details there on how that can be done. And then last, our seventh strategy is focusing on encouraging better fuel cost management using mechanisms such as fuel cost sharing, which basically adjusts how fuel adjustment clauses are implemented and makes it so that utilities have a bit of a skin in the game in terms of managing their fuel costs, as well as economic dispatch, making sure that we are dispatching our most economic resources to meet demand on the system. So with that, I'm going to move us on to our first strategy, anticipating future needs, thinking about how we can assess needs more openly and transparently, making sure that we are paying attention to possible risks and drawing upon realistic expectations as much as possible. Of course, in terms of how this strategy then translates to cost control, it can reduce the potential for unnecessary spending and ensure that the investments that utilities are making are well corroborated. And this can include making improvements to planning processes, such as integrating generation planning with transmission and distribution considerations, right? And if done well, this strategy can really put downward pressure on most or not all of the cost drivers that Xavier walked us through. But we wanted to turn it to our colleague Charles here to highlight how this strategy might be implemented, specifically in connection to load growth from data centers. Charles?
Thank you, Kara, and thanks, Sarah, for having us here today. As Kara said, my work focuses on data centers and load growth that right now are a driver for increasing costs in the PJM interconnection region, of which Kentucky's a part. Their recent capacity auction prices were capped because costs are increasing so much in PJM territory. And the PJM market monitor kind of directly attributes that right now to data centers. So a lot of the implementation of these kind of cost control strategies I'll talk through in the next two examples will focus on data centers and how we can make sure that utilities are spending only as much as they need to serve the loads that are coming online. So first to start, there is deep uncertainty in data center forecasts, requiring new approaches to forecasting as well as planning and how you price the rates for these data centers. So on this graph on the left, you'll see a wide range of data center capacity anticipated to come online by 2030. Oftentimes, data centers are shopping around to many different utilities and jurisdictions to try and find the best location for their data center. So that can sometimes result in phantom load, where you have multiple applications for a singular data center that is not painting a clear picture of what the utility actually needs to build. So a few examples here on the right of what we're seeing in improvements here. So first, separate forecasts are emerging specifically for large loads. Georgia Power now has a separate forecast for large loads and includes individual project status in their large load forecast of has interconnection been approved, like what stage of the process this large load is at. So there's increased transparency in how real this large load might be. Second, it's important to when things are changing so quickly, to have quick exchanges between forecasting, planning, and procurement. And so we see supplemental planning can better navigate the uncertainty of more variable forecasts. The Colorado Public Utilities Commission has recently approved what's called an incremental need pool of generation resources that are available outside of the traditional resource planning process that they have there. In this way, they can still build what they need for all customers as planned and have options if more load materializes than they anticipated. And then lastly, tariffs help to provide transparency. Large load tariffs are a regulatory tool, not the import-export tax, that establish a separate rate class for large loads so that they're their own extra large industrial class. Um, in that, you can make conditions more transparent for ratepayer protections and include additional fees so that you can better ensure that data centers and other large loads in this customer class are paying their fair share. And just before I move on here, I see this question in the chat. There's a number of different factors that contribute to a good data center location. Proximity to a city for like latency can be important depending on the data center type. But access to land, interconnection rights, and power are really some of the biggest constraints. And that, especially in PJM, with the delays that we're seeing to interconnection queues, the ability to interconnect quickly is one of the top priorities for data centers right now. Next slide, please. So clicking specifically on forecasts here, uncertainty is a fact of life, especially in a rapidly changing system. But regulators can ensure that forecasts are thorough, up to date, and validated. And we collectively can engage our regulators to initiate technical conferences and workshops to learn about new best practices, to coordinate by sharing information about incentives and trends across agencies, and to revise planning rules, for example, as we've seen in Colorado, to make sure that these practices are modernized, like establishing a strong project pipeline or doing multiple scenarios in your planning process as opposed to just one. For validation, standardization is really important, and back tests to compare forecast to actuals so that we can learn from our forecasting practices over time. And then you can also put further incentives in there to consider payments or penalties for improvements or shift risks to large loads. As I noted, that tariffs can help to institutionalize. And then lastly, you can just do this more frequently. Update utility forecast quarterly, if not even more frequently. We're seeing a number of examples. Duke in North Carolina has agreed to publish its forecast updates on a quarterly basis now so that it can stay on top of the more rapid forecasting developments as things change very quickly nowadays. Next slide for Kara to intro us into our other lever here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Charles. So our next strategy that we wanted to highlight here is leveraging competition, right? This sort of acknowledges the basic economic theory that fair and open competition can support lowering costs. And so to better harness this power of competition, regulators can explore all source procurement and create pathways to ensure that DERs are being leveraged for their fullest potential value to the grid. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Charles to talk about how this shows up in terms of thinking about managing large loads.
Thanks so much, Kara. And specifically in this example, we're going to be talking about how demand flexibility and making the most use of the grid that we currently have is really going to be key to cost effectively supporting large loads and make sure that costs are not increased and we're not building much more generation than we need. So first in this graphic, this is showing is looking at the Texas grid, and we're seeing number of hours on the x-axis and net load on the y-axis. So we can see if we add a ton of more capacity, as we are looking at this dark blue line, the number of hours where we need to increase the total capacity of the grid is actually comparatively small. We're looking at around less than 500 hours per year. Do we actually need to make the grid do more than it's already doing? And so the opportunity here is to use grid connected resources like smart meters, like community solar, smart thermostats and batteries and other distributed grid resources to cover these 500 hours without greatly increasing costs from new build. In the next slide, as Kara was talking about how we want to make these practices transparent, large load tariffs are really important to ensuring that these pathways are transparent and providing clear investment pathways for large loads into our current grid. There's three different types of tariffs that we're kind of seeing out there. The first is the baseline tariff that establishes the large load customer class, and ensures that there's a base amount of ratepayer protections in there. On top of that, we're seeing flexible service tariffs where the large load customers take non-firm service. They're not on all the time, or they're not guaranteed 100% uptime, and they're given opportunities to invest in grid flexibility to kind of gain more uptime and capacity over the length of the contract. And then lastly is a bring your own resource tariff, where you allow these large load customers to bring a certain amount of generation with them, that creates an additional pathway to bring resources onto the grid more quickly. Kind of like if a sudden new lane of traffic appeared when you were in the midst of a traffic jam, it would help to relieve some of the traffic on the road. And codifying all of these at the Public Utility Commission really makes clear and transparent how we want large loads to finance these grid investments. On the next slide, virtual power plants and aggregation of these distributed energy resources through kind of telecommunications and being able to manage them all in a group can meet demand flexibility needs for data centers so that more generation resources don't need to be built. So on the left here in this blue dotted box, we see all of the ways that data centers can be flexible, right? They can shift power consumption to different times of day. They can bring their own resources, generation and storage flexibility. And they can also shift some of their computational loads geographically, especially for some training models that don't need to be done in the most timely manner or don't need to be done in a kind of geographic specific location. They can move those things around. Offsite flexibility in the form of a virtual power plant coordinates these offsite resources aggregated through utility programs to utilize the grid resources so that the data center, so that we're not over increasing the peak, or so that we're shifting grid resources to cover that peak. In this slide, there's a number of commercial models we can look at to realize this. I just want to focus on the common threads here on the right here, in that large loads should sponsor and provide capital to invest in virtual power plants at scale. And that's something that you can structure into tariffs, is that the large loads can pay an additional fee that helps further fund these virtual power plant programs that can get residential solar on more people's roofs, that can fund additional battery storage projects, that can help build a larger contracting network for smart metering infrastructure. that another thread here is that the utilities or the market operators set an exchange rate for how many megawatts of expedited load interconnection are unlocked for each megawatt of virtual power plant. And this we're seeing in the bring your own resource requirements as well. If large loads want to interconnect to the grid, they need to make sure that they are bringing a commensurate amount of power to the grid. Um, and lastly, virtual power plant aggregators with varying degrees of utility involvements develop and deliver needed capacity to utilities and market operators. So it is not just enough that data centers fund broader solar and smart metering infrastructure and batteries that develop these virtual power plants. We need someone to actually manage the aggregation and deployment of these resources so they can do what we need them to do for the grid in the hours that we need them. And on the last slide, in that I'll present in summary here, policy measures help to unlock this market of virtual power plants where we're using the most of the grid that we have. Interconnection policy or options for large loads to contract their own capacity and allowing them to interconnect more quickly if they're willing to bring more power or bring more investment into the grid. Retail tariffs that establish transparency of how much they are going to be paying. And lastly, this first lever we were talking about, integrated planning and data access. So making sure that this connects back to forecasting and planning, where virtual power plants can meet generation, transmission, and distribution level constraints, and sharing data between the virtual power plant operators, the large loads, and the grid planners so that we can achieve that look back function of understanding how virtual power plants are performing for the grid. Thanks, and I'll pass back to Kara.
Thanks
Sure.
so much, Charles. Oh, Xavier, are you going to take it from here?
Yes, thank you,
Great.
Kara. Thank you, Charles. So now we come to the sixth strategy, avoid insufficient system expansion. As we mentioned earlier, the utility generally have a incentive to overinvest in those capital projects, now leaving low-cost solutions underutilized. So this strategy is aiming to create pathways for utilities to fully leverage other solutions like energy efficiency and the demand flexibility Charles introduced, and is actually what Kentucky is doing right now, and also limit the opportunities for less restrained spending. Deploying the lever under the strategies, they can have like direct influence on all forms of capital spending. And as we mentioned before, given the number of cost tracker in Kentucky, we're going to specifically focus on the third lever, careful consideration of capital cost trackers. So what are cost trackers? They go by various of names, like rate adjustment clauses, automatic adjustment clauses. But in Kentucky, they call it rider mostly, sometimes the adjustment clause. The cost tracker, it is a rate-making mechanism that allows utilities to recover generally the exact amount of money spent for specific categories, like the fuel and purchase power, energy efficiency program, and expenses related to the grid modernization. Well, instead of waiting until the next general or full rate case. For this report and for our presentation, we define cost tracker as mechanism that allow utilities to recover cost outside of a rate case, while with adjustments made on and to expedite basis to reflect the actual spending from the utilities. So cost trackers that can vary in different ways, and there's the four key ways. Firstly, how costs are defined. Some trackers are zero-based, meaning that the utility recover cost as they are incurred. Others are baseline, where the deviation from the approved level is recovered. And secondly, how those adjustments are made. You can typically see accrual adjustments, which the updates allow revenue between rate cases, and the collection reconciliation, which corrects the over or under collections. But in practice, most cost trackers they can use both. And thirdly, timing of approval. Some costs are pre-approved when the trackers is set, while others they are being reviewed after the facts by regulators' commissions. And finally, how much regulatory scrutiny is applied to those cost trackers? This is a big topic. It can range from relatively light check to more thorough reviews, which can like as tough as general rate case. And for Kentucky, the PSC has authorized a significant number of cost trackers for fuel, purchase power, environmental compliance, and recovery for demand-side management program expenses. For example, under the fuel adjustment clause, this cost tracker, utilities will recover fuel and purchase power costs through a specific surcharge on customers' bill. And these costs, these surcharge, they are reviewed for prudency about 6 months later, and then go back again on a 2-year cycle. And these trackers are not actually small. Using Kentucky Power as an example, for a typically household, about 10% of the total bill comes from trackers. So in practice, the meaningful share of customer bills is being adjusted outside of base rates. With that, I'll hand it over to Kara to walk through the next session.
Yeah, and I'll try to wrap up in about 5 minutes or so. So if you move on to the next slide, Xavier. So why cost trackers exist in the first place, right? The benefits in terms of the utility perspective and also in terms of regulators. So they can offer administrative efficiency, and this really depends on how they are implemented, the design of them, as well as how frequent rate cases are in a state. But if rate cases are happening once a year, they can offer some administrative efficiency. They can also make certain categories of utility spending easier to track, right? When they are dedicated on a particular category of costs, that is then tracked over time, and then the utility is able to get cost recovery for that instead of, sort of all of the costs that are lumped together and recovered via base rates. This also can allow regulators to apply different rate-making treatments for them. For example, if there's reason to lower the return on those track costs, that can give a regulator an opportunity. They also could allow regulators to be more prescriptive in utility spending. So if there are particular cost trackers for example, reliability investments, making sure that only certain costs that are eligible are recovered through that tracker. They can help increase transparency if they are sort of separate from base rates in terms of what customers see on the bill. And then from a utility perspective, they reduce their financial and business risks, right? Like as Xavier said, the purpose of those trackers are to reduce regulatory lag and to provide fast cost recovery that avoids uncertainty and delay of disallowances, perhaps associated with a rate case. However, if you go on to the next slide, cost trackers can have a significant impact on cost containment and can amplify utility perverse incentives. So this is an area that we're focusing a lot on right now. Xavier made a reference, but we just came out with a report that goes through ways to better contain costs for costs that flow through cost trackers. But in some cost trackers weaken cost containment incentives by reducing regulatory lag and reducing thus the likelihood of disallowance for utilities. They also reduce the time for review of costs. So They're usually the regulatory process to review costs when it does actually happen is much shorter than what is included in a rate case. They can also have design features that basically just automatically pass on cost to customers. So there actually isn't the review that's required elsewhere. And then there can be a risk of double recovery, especially with the number of cost trackers, for example, that we're seeing in Kentucky. There's a risk of not knowing what costs are being recovered where, or what costs are being recovered through base rates that might also be recovered through a cost tracker. And so that can also significantly impact cost increases. Because of all of this, right, cost trackers run the risk of exacerbating those perverse incentives, CapEx bias and gold plating incentives. And then the growing sort of number of cost recovery dockets, if each of those mechanisms have their own proceedings, right, that then can just offset any sort of administrative efficiency and increase administrative burden, and then also make it very difficult to understand sort of the total or aggregate rate impacts of these different mechanisms over time. And then we also saw, while we were doing a little bit of research, that in 2022, actually, the Kentucky Legislative Research Commission did a study where they highlighted that cost trackers have the potential to weaken cost control incentives and aren't currently right now offset by reductions in a utility ROE, meaning if cost trackers reduce risk, therefore, there should be a sort of commensurate reduction in their ROE to reflect that reduced risk, which is something that states have been considering. Next slide. And so, of course, given that, you know, the affordability crisis and increasing rates that we're seeing across the country, it's important that we're looking at where cost savings can be possible wherever. And given that an increasing percentage of utility expenditures are being recovered through cost trackers, we argue that it is time to examine how these cost trackers are being used in states and see what reforms might be possible. So we recommend that regulators revisit the rationale for each cost tracker that's being implemented in the state to see if it's still necessary to maintain that, and retire cost trackers in those instances where they may no longer be necessary, to consider where there might be possible opportunities to consolidate costs that are tracked back into base rates where appropriate. And then for those cost trackers that remain, consider ways to support utility cost control. And so next slide, because I'm looking at the time here. Some strategies that we outline in our report that just came out last week. We recommend that regulators go through a process to really understand the size of the problem, to take a step back and assess the scale and impact of the various cost trackers in a state, to understand the breadth of tracker implementation and, importantly, analyze the financial impacts of these mechanisms on customer bills. We also recommend that regulators consider what reporting requirements might be helpful. So to better track how utilities are spending under these trackers and identify trends that might require regulatory intervention. Second, we recommend reintroducing the risk of disallowance for track costs when appropriate. This can include different strategies such as setting spending caps, so basically capping the amount of utility spending under a cost tracker, creating links to performance, so basically tying potentially a portion of cost recovery to actually delivering benefits with investments, or potentially tying earnings potential to the delivery of benefits, so that regulators are ensuring that these investments are being used to their full potential. Reintroducing regulatory lag for a portion of costs. We've seen a few states do that approach, as well as think about what timelines are required to review costs and potentially extending those to ensure regulators and stakeholders have an adequate opportunity for review. This third strategy here focuses on incentivizing efficient spending under cost trackers. Once again, right, these really have the risk of exacerbating CapEx bias and gold plating. And so thinking about where there might be an opportunity, for example, to implement a shared savings mechanism or potentially use a different rate of return for track costs to ensure that utilities are being strategic and efficient with their spending. And then lastly, we recommend to strengthen the burden of proof in authorizing new cost trackers. So really thinking about the eligibility criteria for new cost trackers and making sure regulators are setting those to be as clear and comprehensive as possible to limit the quantity of requests that utilities come in for new cost trackers to be implemented. So with that, that's our content for our presentation. Just in terms of, you know, how you can think about RMI in your various efforts, right? We're always happy to share information, to brief stakeholders on what we're finding in different states and bringing in lessons learned and insights. We are always happy to work with you all in terms of trying to diagnose what challenges or key cost drivers might be present in your context, and help think about what opportunities stakeholders might have in addressing those cost drivers. And then we're also happy to facilitate conversations to the extent it's helpful, especially thinking about for regulatory stakeholder processes to help create strategies to address these cost increases. But with that, I'm going to open it up. I know we have a small crew today, but if any of you have questions on what we presented or anything on the framework that we discussed or how those strategies might be applied to large loads, we can take the time to hear those.
Yes, thank you all so much. This was really informative. And if anybody has any questions, you can come off mute or put it in the chat. And I will also put the link to RMI's report in the chat as well. Wallace, you have a question?
I can always think of questions. Gosh. Two of them that popped into mind are A, how do we fight CapEx bias? And B, do large load centers have these cost add-on, I forget the term you were using, but the things like fuel adjustment clauses and environmental compliance costs that we see as cost riders here in Louisville. Do those tend to be, you had a very nice example on Western Kentucky, how the add-ons are 10% of the typical bill. I'm curious if that tends to be the case with large loads, but maybe we should talk about the CapEx bias first, because that's a big one and pervasive.
It is, and it's not an easy challenge necessarily to tackle, Wallace. Yeah, so we have a lot of other research also that focuses more squarely on those perverse use incentives and different mechanisms to potentially implement to address those perverse incentives. For CapEx bias, we tend to point to, and I mentioned this in the brief overview of the framework, but CapEx OpEx equalization. So that mechanism under strategy 4, right? And so these are a group of mechanisms that are intended to basically level the playing field between CapEx and OpEx incentives. So this, and to date, the US have implemented these mechanisms in a more targeted fashion. So for example, non-wire solutions, right? So when utilities are considering infrastructure upgrades, there sometimes can be an opportunity to actually use aggregated distributed energy resources instead of building out that infrastructure. But of course, the utility has that incentive to choose that expensive infrastructure upgrade instead. And so states have implemented shared savings mechanisms to incentivize the utility to actually pursue that lower cost OpEx-based solution, those aggregated DERs. And what those look like is basically allow the utility to keep a portion of the cost savings. So you sort of compare the traditional infrastructure solution to that lower cost alternative, and then utilities are able to keep a portion of savings. But overall, the net costs are lowered. That's just an example, one example. Obviously, reducing ROE is also an example of sort of more straightforwardly reducing that that delta between the cost of equity, right, and the utility profits that they're able to keep. In other countries, they've addressed CapEx bias more comprehensively in the UK and in Australia, for example. The UK, they implement TOTEX rate making, which basically pools together both CapEx and OpEx, and then creates a capitalization rate. So there's no differentiation between the two. And so that's been implemented there as well as in Italy. And then Australia has other regulatory mechanisms that more holistically try to address those incentives across the utility spending. Yeah. I want to also, maybe Charles, you can, I'm not sure if you can touch upon Wallace's second question about like how the tariffs, maybe Wallace, you can repeat that. So you're wondering, are cost trackers used for large loads tariffs, or?
Yeah. I mean, you had the nice example of how in a residential bill in the Western Kentucky or in the Kentucky Power Company service area, the cost trackers may be 10% of the bill. And I was wondering if that tends to be the case with the large load centers too, or does just the base consumption of electricity get to be the major factor?
Yeah, to my knowledge, I haven't seen cost trackers applied specifically to the large load context, but my team is starting to do some analysis on cost allocation to understand for a given rate and a set of tariff provisions, and the cost of generation transmission, if the revenue from the large load tariff will be sufficient to recover the costs incurred to like build the resources necessary to supply the large load. We haven't seen that kind of institutionalized. There's like a ton of different analysis on how load growth affects different rates, but we have the variety of approaches has not yet reached the level of kind of standardization that we see in cost trackers.
Yeah, I think there is a risk though, Wallace, and I'm trying to remember, Xavier. I know that you all potentially just approved some new gas plants in Kentucky. I think we saw that. And we were trying to figure out if a cost tracker was put in place to recover those costs, or if those were integrated into base rates. I think potentially a cost tracker. So this might be a very live issue in Kentucky right now. Xavier, do you want to maybe provide context on what you found?
Sure. So for those new approved generators, so they'll be recovered through cost trackers, as far as I know. So, but the thing is, they set up few criterias for those costs. So they have to approve that like certain amount of megawatt hours of electricity has been sold to the large load customers. And there's another like factor, and I actually forgot the exact name of the factor, but I get back to you later. So they'll reach a certain amounts of the factor. And thirdly, and they with these several criterias, they can ensure that the cost for this project is eligible for return. And besides that, they also create a new tariff for those large load customers. So it's kind of like use it or lose it. So for example, if Google or other companies have a contract with these two generators, so that I will use like 800 megawatt hours in following 20 years. But if unfortunately, if you didn't reach that amount, you still need to pay that amount of usage for electricity. So with this specific kind of tariff, they can ensure the healthier operation for these two the generator, especially they are being approved under the certain standard for these data centers. So it is necessary and a very good way to keep the affordability for other customer in Kentucky.
All right. I know we are right at 2, so I want to make sure, if you all need to hop off, that's totally fine. We are recording this webinar, so that will be available on YouTube, and I'll send a follow-up email after this call with all of the links that were put in the chat. I did have a couple of questions, but I can reach out to you all and ask that. But I just wanted to say thank you all so much for joining today. I think this was extremely informative and very timely for Kentucky with the new approval of our gas plants to serve a 40% increase in load because of a data center that may come here to Louisville. So we've been keeping an eye on that. And we'll be sure to keep everybody informed. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining. And if anybody is interested, I don't know if RMI is interested, we will have our next webinar in April, and that will be a review of the 2026 legislative session and what that means for energy and housing in Kentucky. And there are a lot of bills related to that. So we will be sure to keep everybody in the loop.
Great. Thanks all.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
you.